Hi, this is Pat Moorhead with More Insights and Strategy, and we are here with Peter Chapman, IonQ President and CEO, for another Insider podcast. How are you, Peter?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Pat.
Thanks for coming on. And as we talked about in the green room, I know there's nothing more you would love to do than do a podcast and get your message out. And you do have an incredible story, and a lot of people are very excited about that. But for those who might not be too familiar with quantum computing out there, maybe we can start off by talking about kind of what it is, why it matters to not just technologically, but to society and the market.
So quantum computing is a whole new mode of computation. It's unlike today's computers in kind of every regard. It's akin, if you will, to more how a GPU works next to a classical computer. And why does it matter? Well, it turns out today's classical computers, even though they seem all powerful and they can do just about anything, it turns out they can't. And so there's a set of business problems which we need a much more powerful computer to be able to solve many of, to be honest, one of mankind's grand challenges. And so we think quantum computing can be the solution to answer everything from, maybe climate change to drug discovery to new batteries, literally many of the challenges which sit ahead of mankind today.
Yeah, it is exciting. And, I've been researching, I guess we call it classical computing, for over 30 years. And, when you look at the architectures and even Moore's law, we needed something different. And, an interim solution appeared to be the accelerators like a GPU or an ASIC, but it looks like the end. You never want to call anything the end game, but quantum computing is as close as you're going to get to the end game as possible. Yeah.
It's maybe not for all problems, but for a subset of problems, they definitely seems like this would be a great solution.
Yeah. So you come from a family of futurists. Your father was a NASA astronaut, which is cool. Not too many people can say that. How did you become interested in quantum computing, and why did you decide to be the CEO of IonQ?
So I started in the computer business back in the mid 70s. My dad brought home an early Apple II, and I just fell in love with these new computers, and very quickly went and started working at the MIT AI lab under Marvin Minsky. I fell in love with AI, and I'm talking about the AI. That word has gotten dual use now. There's machine learning, and then there's kind of the AI and for movies. I'm interested in the AI for movie part. But back then, with only 8K of memory, it became pretty obvious we weren't going to build, those kinds of programs with that hardware. And so I kind of shelved that and got out of AI for many, many years. And when the cloud computing started to come into play, I thought, well, now maybe I could have a system powerful enough to actually build it. But then realized that's really not powerful enough either. And so what I really needed was a quantum computer to solve that problem. So I kind of joined the company because I actually need the quantum computer myself for my own kind of private hobby, which is to build an AI system. And sure enough, I do think that quantum now will be the thing that breaks through kind of that kind of AI system that we see in movies in the future.
So some people bird watch, other people watch a series on Netflix, and for fun, you build AI systems. So I think That in itself says a lot about you. Very impressive. And I think I told you this before. Whenever I walk into a room, if everybody involved in computing, in quantum computing, I can pretty much say, okay, just want to let everybody know I do not have a PhD, but I'm here to explain the magic that you create to the rest of the world. So there's a place for all of us, but very impressive. So the potential for quantum is massive. It's huge, and it's funny. It's sometimes people are like, "Well, what's the growth going to be?" Right? And it's big enough to matter. We don't have to have an exact number, but it's massive. But can you tell us a little bit about how IonQ was formed, how was it started, and also the team that you built? Because what I understand is that some of your team members come from the very inception of things like trapped ion. So let's brag a little bit here.
Yep. No. The two co-founders, Chris Monroe and Jungsang Kim, have been in quantum since the very beginning. In fact, actually, Chris was at NIST back in 1995, did the world's first ever quantum logic gate. And that really kind of started this whole thing off. And so since then, the two, they're professors at both University of Maryland and at Duke, have been working on quantum using government funding, and have looked at many different ways to solve this problem and decided that ion traps are probably the best solution kind of going forward. Back in 2015, Chris and Jungsang wrote a paper that got picked up by a guy named Harry Weller, who was running the East Coast division of NEA, the huge venture firm. And God knows why he was, reading scientific papers, but it probably says a lot about Harry and his success. And so he read Chris's paper and Jungsang's, and he thought this read like a business plan. And so NEA approached, the two co-founders to put money in, which is pretty unusual unto itself, because usually it goes the other way. You go chase the VCs. So this was the VCs chasing us. So that became the beginning of IonQ, with the seed money that came in from NEA. And then very quickly they got Google and Amazon and NEA to come into the first round. And then what was very cool is they put together a deal with the University of Maryland and also with Duke to exclusively license royalty-free the IP that the two professors had developed over the last 15 years and going forward until 2026. So we kind of work in conjunction with the universities. And obviously IonQ, that's kind of the basis for IonQ.
Yeah, that's a cool story. Some things come to mind, like the A-Team, or these new superhero movies of people who you would know kind of coming together to create something. Sometimes there's friction, but most of the times they do some pretty crazy stuff, and I hope you do that as well. Not the friction part, but the creating big stuff.
Yeah. Well, luckily it turns out that on Chris's side, he's the physicist, and on Jungsang's side, he's the engineer. And so the two of them actually come together. So there isn't much friction. I think they almost, between the two of them, make a whole person in some sense, right? So they complement each other in ways which is really cool. So
the symbiotic system. I understand that. So it's kind of my wife and I. So
exactly.
They're very different. So so big news recently in that IonQ quantum computers are now available on Google Cloud. And essentially that makes you the only quantum computing provider on the big three right now. So Google, AWS, and Azure. And I mean, I feel like I've explained this significance to people, but for those who don't, from your point of view and your customers, what is the significance and the value of being available on on the big three?
Well, there's kind of multiple ways to look at it. First, obviously, is just ease of getting to our hardware. You probably know, it's often could take quite a long time for bureaucracy to figure out how to open an account and, become an approved vendor. But everyone has, between the big three, everyone
Yeah.
has an account with those guys. So it's easy to piggyback on that. But the other aspect is, Google is there are several software development toolkits for quantum, and Google has one. And so, in addition to being available on their cloud, we got software support for them for their quantum languages to run on our hardware. And so, we have wanted to make sure that everyone's toolkits, doesn't matter what who it is, actually runs on our hardware, so that there's kind of no excuse not to be able to run on our hardware.
Yeah, and listen, from my point of view, and I cover multiple workloads on the big three, and net people want options, right? And
Yeah,
typically they have a primary and they have a secondary cloud vendor, and if the one quantum option is your tertiary, then it's just more work that you're going to have to do to link them up into your operations.
exactly. And
Yeah.
now at this point, we've covered most of the cloud in the United States here with these three, and now covered almost 100% of the quantum software toolkits as well.
Yeah. So let's move to programming languages and dev kits here. So you recently published this chart that I'm gonna flash up here.
Yep.
Yeah, you recently published this chart showing your compatibility with more quantum programming language and dev kits than any other company out there right now. So what does this mean for customers, especially in the light of the announcement that you just did with Google Cloud?
Well, it means that no matter what the toolkit that a developer is using for quantum, it will run on IonQ hardware. And so we don't have a programming language that we're trying to push. Instead, what we're doing is making sure that others' quantum toolkits languages actually run on our hardware, and it's easy for developers to make that happen. We want it to be a frictionless experience. So we announced recently support for IBM's toolkit and also Google's, and that kind of completes now. We have basically support by everyone in their various toolkits. So no matter what toolkit a developer is using, you can now run it on IonQ.
How do Qiskit users get involved?
Qiskit users can either do one of two things. They can either open an account directly with us and run directly, or they could run it through Google as an example and run it through the Google Cloud. Either way.
Interesting. In a way, you're almost making quantum look easy. I know it's not, but when you remove objections out there, it makes things a whole lot easier. It's a lot of work, don't get me wrong, but it makes things move along quite nicely. So let's talk about differentiation. My analyst firm, Moor Insights and Strategy, and Paul Smith Goodson, we track a lot of different companies in this space, and I'm curious, how are you different? How are you better than your competitors?
Well, first, as we talked about, everyone's software works directly on our hardware, so that no one else can say that. So we have the best software support. As you mentioned, across all three cloud vendors, no one else has that. But in terms of the hardware itself, we have the best quantum computers in the market today. And so there's, what is it's needed to build a quantum computer? And it's really two things. You need to have good quality qubits, and you need to be able to control them. And so in our case, we're using individual ions as one qubit. And as such, we didn't manufacture the atoms. Those come by Mother Nature. Every atom is identical to every other atom in the universe, as long as it's in the same atomic species. And so in that sense, they're perfect. So we say that these qubits natively are absolutely perfect, which is true. We have no manufacturing errors. And so we others, when you look at it, is they're trying to build a man-made qubit. And so there's a problem. They have a manufacturing problem because we just don't have technology to get down to manufacturing at the scale that's needed in terms of a man-made qubit. But at IonQ, we kind of say Mother Nature's qubit, which is Mother Nature actually did the manufacturing. The next part is actually being able to control the qubit. And these qubits are kind of, I'll say kind of shy. They do not like interacting with the environment in any way, shape, or form. If the qubit is bothered, it will fall apart and it will stop doing computation. So in our particular case, what we're doing is we're taking the individual atoms, the ions, and we're suspending them in a vacuum, and we've completely isolated them from the environment. And they're being levitated in a electromagnetic field on top of a little chip. And so they're perfectly isolated from the world. Because of the vacuum, they're not getting interacted with any other particles. And the way that we program them, instead of trying to attach a wire to them, which would be a funny thing because I'm not quite sure how you attach a wire to an individual atom, but instead what we do is we use a laser and we use a photon. And as you know, photon light has a very light touch to it. So what's happening here is the lasers are coming in and hitting these ions. And so it all in all has this extremely light touch. And so what that means is that the system can, there's a technical term, kind of T-coherence, but it really means is they stay together so that they work, so that you can actually run a quantum program. If you look at some of the competition, is they're using silicon and they're building a man-made qubit. And if you actually, an individual qubit might be 10 to the 14 atoms, quite a few atoms. If you actually looked at it as under a microscope, you'd see it's fuzzy. And it looks like a shag carpet from the 1970s. And that's just showing you that we just don't have the manufacturing technology to lay down atoms, one atom at a time, in exactly the structure we need. And then because they're mounted onto a silicon substrate, all the noise and everything that comes from that environment then comes into the qubits, and they don't like it, and then they tend to decohere. So what they have done on that side often is to try to lower the temperature down to 0 degrees Kelvin. And on our side, because we've got it in a vacuum, we're running them at room temperature. And so there's these huge differences in the architecture. The bottom line at the end of it all is that the ion trap technology we're using has the best fidelity, meaning it can run the most complicated circuits in the marketplace today. And so it's not very controversial. Ion traps kind of beat all the other technologies in terms of fidelity. And that's important when we get to the next phase of computing, right? Which is It is all about how do we get to error correction. And
and I was going to ask, like, how many qubits do you have to get at before you have to start using error correction?
Well, it really depends on your error rate. So if this error rate that's in these, we call them noisy quantum computers, if the error correction is dependent on the error itself. We use error correction today. Actually, in this video, between us is the internet, and those are all error corrected as well. And so classical computing, we use error correction all the time. In quantum, we need to do the same. And the amount of error correction you need to do is dependent on your error. So if you have a 95% error rate, it really doesn't matter how many qubits you have, because only 3 or 4 of them would actually be usable. You could have 100 qubit chip, and with that error rate, 3 would be usable. If you had a 1,000,000 qubit chip, it wouldn't change the usability of the chip. It would still only be 3. So, and then what's worse is that if you have a high error, like a 95%, then maybe the amount of error correction you might need to do. And error correction here, what you do in a quantum world, is you use more physical qubits to make one better one. And so the overhead for that might be 1,000,000 to 1. You might need 1,000,000 qubits to create one good qubit. IonQ is the only company in the last year with Duke and University of Maryland to show an error-corrected qubit working, and we did it with only 13, an overhead of only 13 qubits. And the reason for that is just simply the error rates are so good that the overhead for the error correction can be small. So it would not be unusual for other technologies to have 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, or even 1,000,000 needed in physical qubits just to create one good one. And so we have that advantage in the second phase because we're the only company that has actually done an error-corrected qubit where it's actually shown to be better. So that's kind of the next phase in kind of the maturity of the quantum market.
Well, and that brings me to my next question, which is assessing quantum performance. I've been on benchmark consortiums, and my background is product management and product marketing. So I've done my share of benchmarking as well. I've worked on industry standard benchmarks. I've blown up benchmarks. I've created benchmarks, and I'm curious, how do we benchmark today? How do we know which one is the best beyond the scientific explanation that you just gave? And how should investors, customers, and developers think about which hardware to go with in lieu of having, something industry standard that everybody has agreed on?
Well, we definitely, as an industry, need to create a standardized benchmark, which is not run by the vendors. Is run by, we need one of those sticker pages you see on cars, right? It says this is the average gas mileage you're going to get with your quantum computer. And so today there is a few attempts at doing some sort of early benchmarking. IBM has a benchmark called quantum volume, and it's basically trying to, unlike the classical versions, which are trying to tell you how quickly a processor works, this benchmark is trying to tell you how big a quantum program you can actually run. And because the larger the program you can run, the more commercially interesting it is. And so so this is kind of roughly, but there's a lot to benchmarking in terms of kind of what's the right benchmark and and how to do it. Generally, we've put up a calculator on our website, which takes the IBM quantum volume, and we kind of shrank it down. We call them useful qubits. It's based on the IBM quantum volume, but in quantum volume, they exponentiated the result. And instead what we did is we took the log base 2 of it, and what it gets you is the number of usable qubits. It tells you basically out of this quantum computer, for most applications, how many of the qubits, the basis of the computation, can be used in your quantum program. And so, people can use that calculator and type in competitors' numbers, and they'll see what the number of usable qubits are. And if you went and did that, you'd see that IonQ, wins fairly easily.
So this is an estimator, and I'm wondering why doesn't IonQ just run it and issue something as opposed to estimating it? Or maybe you have and you just haven't published it yet.
Yeah, no. So on many people have published results. They come out, to be honest, every month. Somebody comes out and compares our systems to the competitors. We don't usually have to do it because there's lots of researchers and customers who do that all the time. And every time they do, we come out on top. And so we don't, we don't feel the need for that. In general, too, since most of the vendors are not, they're writing papers about systems which are sitting in labs, we would much rather have customers and independent third parties be the one that verify these things, rather
Yeah, it
than.
is. Yeah, that is better. I do like the drag racing because it gets more people interested,
Yeah,
right? And we saw this with classical. I mean, we see this with PCs. I mean, today, a vendor in classical computing announced that they won 14 top benchmarks with their new systems based on spec, right?
yeah.
So it keeps people excited. You know, we've got the top 500 supercomputers, so I'm hoping we get there ultimately. The definition of algorithmic qubits does absolutely make sense as a way to compare quantum computers. But I'm wondering, there are other features that distinguish IonQ's architecture and approach, correct?
That is very much so. So there's how we program these quantum computers, as I mentioned, is just a set of atoms which are sitting in a vacuum chamber, and then we wire them up, if you will, using light, using a laser. And so what our compiler does is it takes a quantum circuit and it kind of, if you will, builds the perfect chip for that particular program. If you look at what our competition's doing, often what they're doing is they're building a chip and they're designing at design time what the kind of least common denominator would be for all possible programs in the future. And so, or they will have to get to a point where they'll put out a custom chip for every application. And so what's cool about our technology
Interesting.
is basically at compile time, you're getting a custom chip. It's not literally, but we've wired it up in a way that's the best for your particular application. And so that's really cool.
By the way, that's the best explanation I have ever heard of that feature, and I'm not doubting that it's true, but I'll just say that you get this going. I mean that could be a game changer in itself. You go the classical computer folks are still figuring out how to create custom chips, but they have to do it in the package, and it took them 40 years to get there with 3D packaging and TSVs. But the notion of customization sounds pretty awesome.
It's very cool. And one of the neat things about it is you can apply error correction in the circuit only where it's needed. Right? Because this error correction is kind of expensive, right? So you don't want to use up your precious qubits when you don't need to. So let's just use it in the places we need to in the circuit and nowhere else. And so the compiler can really optimize the hell out of this chip for one particular application.
Wow. I love it. That's cool. And I'm going to, everybody, we should just stew on this for a while. But hey, let's jump into the IonQ as an investment. But before we go into this, I want to remind everybody, this show is for educational information purposes only. Check out your financial specialist if you wanted investment advice. Now, with that said, let me jump into this. So you're jumping into this head first with your SPAC and your PIPE transaction. Company's going to be listed New York Stock Exchange under the IonQ badge. So where does IonQ go from here as a public company? Why would somebody want to invest now versus, let's say, in the future? I mean, we've got some of these pundits saying that quantum computing is uninvestable. I heard a podcaster and a VC say that the other day.
Yep. Just interesting, a couple of things. When I first joined the company 2 years ago, there was a major article by a professor out of the Europe who said quantum computing would never work. And I think actually Wilbur and Orville, the week that they flew at Kitty Hawk, there was also somebody who said flying would never work too. It was on
read that. I read that Sorry, it wasn't an autobiography, but an incredible book about that. And I remember that, and I think it was the folks over in France that made that comment.
Made that comment, yes. So what's interesting is in the last year, we've put our systems out in the cloud. I don't hear from anything from those people anymore because, for $1 and a credit card and one of these accounts, you can go write your first quantum program. So, we've kind of put the doubters behind us. So the question as to why today to invest, that's really kind of the purpose of SPACs, right? You could, we could wait for the company to go to a traditional IPO. But by that time, not all, but a lot of the value has already been created. And, you're missing out on it. And so the question is, there is definitely higher risk and hopefully higher return here. But the question is do you want to capture that upside as we get to being kind of, a traditional IPO company and miss that upside? And what is that upside between now and kind of that future is every generation of hardware that we come out is getting closer. At about 72 qubits, you can take on the world's largest supercomputer or take on the cloud itself for certain applications. And the world's largest supercomputer, they tell me, runs, it takes the power of Hoover Dam to run. But our quantum computer will be able to compete, and it runs off a standard wall socket. And so as we make progress on the technical progress to that, each one will be a validation and an opportunity for the stock price to go up. And in addition, we're now working with customers on various applications, and each one of those is a potential for a breakthrough. And so it is definitely early days. It's kind of like the beginnings, the mid 70s in the computer business. We're still waiting for Bill Gates to come along and produce Quantum Basic, and we're waiting for Dan Birkeland to come along with the quantum spreadsheet. So it's early. But as soon as those things start to appear, then the thing's going to take off. And so the question is who would have rather invested in Intel in the 1970s or waiting, much, much later? I would argue you probably should have invested early. So,
yeah, Peter, and I saw it pick off a couple other reactions in the industry that in the past month that I thought were fascinating as well, and I think that's good. I think that's good for the market.
Definitely, competition is always good, and it's also showing that this level of financial support is also good for the quantum industry. So I think it's good for the entire.
You're partnering with DMYI, right?
That is correct. Yep. So today, if investors wish to invest in the company, they can do so by acquiring DMYI stock, which when we get to the public listing, we'll switch over to IonQ, the IonQ ticker symbol, which I'm very happy the company very early on decided to choose a company name with only 4 letters, so we didn't have to run through the usual exercise of choosing ticker symbols.
Yes, and by the way, thank you for doing it like you did. It drives me crazy, and I think especially for retail investors, it just makes it a lot easier to find the company when they're trying to buy or sell.
Agreed. Very much.
So, Peter, I could sit here for another hour and do this, and I think our listeners would love it too. But we always try to keep it short here on the More Insights and Strategy Insider podcast. I just want to thank you for coming on. It was really a fascinating discussion, and every time I talk about it, I get educated and give the ability to do better analysis. And I love what IonQ is bringing to the table. Super, super exciting.
Pat, it's always fun. I look forward to doing it again in the future. So
Absolutely.
thank you so much.
Good. And then congratulations again on your Google win there as well. I just throw that in there.
Thank you. Thank you. We appreciate it.
Yeah. So this is Pat Moorhead with More Insights and Strategy, closing out another More Insights and Strategy Insider. Thank you for coming. If you like what you've heard, hit the subscribe button up there. If you have any suggestions, hit me up on Twitter. It's the easiest way. But with that, I'm going to take us out of here. Have a great week.